Welcome back, and thank you for joining us for the second episode of the Coptic Canadian History Project Scholars Discuss Coptic Studies. This audio blog series aims to bring together junior and established scholars from across North America and to offer insight on the research being conducted on Coptic populations around the world. My name is Akladios, PhD candidate in History at York University. I am joined today by Youssef, PhD candidate in Anthropology at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Joey.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
And I'd like to thank you for being here with us and ask you to introduce yourself to our listeners. Tell them more about you, your history, and your academic background.
My pleasure. So I was born in Egypt. I immigrated with my parents when I was 5 months old. And you can sort of describe my childhood as one saturated in the church. With vigils for Apocalypse Night, Kiak, the month of Kiak, and learning hymns and all these things. That's in terms of my life in the church. At home, my parents, my father maybe more so stressed that I speak Arabic, and really helped and tried to always encourage me to do so. One of the methods they helped me one of the methods they encouraged was watching Coptic saint movies. Many of them included English subtitles as well, which sort of helped me learn the language better. On a more family-oriented note, my grandfather was best friends with His Holiness Pope Shenouda III. And always really had told me stories about him growing up, and really Pope Shenouda was sort of an exemplary figure in my childhood. I had the opportunity to meet him when I was 4 years old as well, which sort of was an important moment, I guess, in sort of my life in the church. Another thing about my childhood as well is that my father had a very close friend who's a monk, and he entered the monastery after university, and anytime we went to the monastery, my father tried to meet him. He would apologize and say that he was busy, and this happened several times. So I became very intrigued. Why isn't this monk meeting us? There's something more important, of course, that's happening. So you could say there's kind of a romanticization or a kind of idealization of the monk, and you could say really that I had a kind of fascination with monks, maybe an obsession even, where I was very intrigued and I wanted to understand more. I want to know what monks were like.
That brings me to, I think, one of my burning questions. Why anthropology, and why the Copts?
So initially, actually, I never even actually considered anthropology at all. I was enrolled in international development studies, and anthropology was one of my breadth requirements I had to take. And I realized that when I took anthropology courses as well as religion courses, that these were the ones I was most successful at, and simply I was really engaged and loved the material that I was learning. And thankfully, my parents never really pushed me into engineering, pharmacy, or medicine like many Coptic parents do. But let me sort of discover my own interests and what I was good at. So that kind of helped me sort of cultivate my love for anthropology as a discipline and learn more. And as an undergrad, I ended up with a double major in international development studies and anthropology and a minor in religion. When I decided to pursue my master's degree, one of the things that I really appreciated most about anthropology is that there's this kind of inclusiveness and an ability to engage with multiple forms of discourse and ethnographic investigation. One which is widely called native anthropology, or insider anthropology, which is an insider studying their own group of people or society. But even before that, with my interest in anthropology, I I thought it would be interesting to take on or apply for a grant that the university was offering for undergrads to receive funding to do some kind of research and then come back to the community or come back to the university community and speak about it. So I received funding. I went to Egypt and I spent about 4 months there, and went to monasteries and came back and gave a talk about my findings in the campus. In 4th year, I took an ethnographic research course where I conducted fieldwork in the GTA among second-generation Copts. And it's kind of funny how things worked out for my doctoral thesis, because what ended up happening is I kind of combined both ideas, both of my interests, as my interest in monasticism and my interest also in second-generation Copts. So I guess in a nutshell, I realized early in my academic career that I really enjoyed anthropology, and at the same time, little work had been done on Copts, and I thought I could use my positionality to help me start conducting this research.
Well, this brings us directly to the question of your positionality as a Copt and a very religious person, but at the same time a researcher. How does that position, both within the community and within the academic environment, affect your fieldwork and your research?
I think it's sort of a two-edged sword of sorts. My positionality is one as within the community. I had access to monasteries which are generally closed off to the public, even the regular lay Copt. So I was granted access to and the privilege within these communities to witness the daily life of the monks and see things which the ordinary Copt, as I said, wouldn't necessarily see except when they visit a monastery on a day trip, and just sort of in a limited sense, but I got to enter into that life. While that was a pro, one of the cons, I guess, or one of that second edge of the sword, is that at times I feel that my research is very familiar to me. I get too comfortable and I know it very well. So through experiences I've come to learn, what I've done is try to always step back from my work for maybe a month or two even, and look at my field notes with an approach of searching for that which is unfamiliar, and identifying patterns that my interlocutors speak about, which they articulate to me in various interviews and in my participation, sort of looking for those patterns and themes that maybe I didn't think about before, and trying to contextualize it to make sense of how my interlocutors describe and make sense of their worldviews more broadly.
And as a part of your research, you look at both monasteries in Egypt and in the United States.
Yes.
So how are they similar, and are there any differences that you'd like to share?
I think one way to look at the relationship between both is that they sort of they function in relation to each other, and I'll explain in a moment what I mean by that. But first I want to address one important point, and that is the ways in which the Coptic monk, and maybe even Coptic clergy more broadly, are socially imagined. And when I say imagined, it doesn't necessarily mean something that is fake, but something that becomes a means by which we characterize a certain individual or a group of people. So throughout my fieldwork, something that was very interesting to me was that people would, in their critique of monks, even some monks among themselves, would say that they lost their purpose. Monks have lost their purpose and are not really monks the way that monks should be. They're not like Saint Anthony or Saint Macarius or Saint Pachomius. You know, they're not ascetic as they used to be. They're very materialistic. You hear, I mean, a lot of these things, right?
And this critique is coming from both inside and outside the church?
From within monasteries and outside of monasteries, so amongst themselves and amongst ladies. So that made me really think, what is it that makes a monk a monk? And I began to, in my research both inside and outside Egypt, I realized that a lot of the positions of monasteries outside of Egypt are a reaction to what's happening inside of Egypt, in sort of trying to cultivate again that the sense of a monk as the monk who's socially imagined as the monk, the moral exemplar. So, for example, there are certain monasteries in diaspora, in the United States in particular, that don't allow their monks to have cell phones. In Egypt, it's quite common to see monks with cell phones, and a huge point of critique, as I said. This particular monastery doesn't allow, the abbot doesn't allow the monks to carry cell phones, except for the abbot prior, or the father prior, sorry, who uses it for administrative purposes. So that's sort of a reaction to what's happening in Egypt. And then also, for example, there's a group in Southern California called St. Paul's Brotherhood, which is sort of an alternative form of thinking through monasticism, of young men who want to remain celibate, want to live a celibate life and have an inclination towards monasticism, but don't necessarily want to live in the monastery, but have a desire to serve in the community. And I guess you can sort of think of St. Paul's Brotherhood as modeled after the Jesuits or the Franciscans, who have sort of more a service-oriented role within the communities. So again, that's a reaction to what's happening in Egypt, where you have a lot of most monasteries now have several priests. Almost all monks at one point get ordained as priests, whereas historically speaking, we had only one monk, for example, who's a priest amongst several monks. So, for example, when we read in the history of the church, you have Saint Isidore, the priest of Scetis, right? Who was the one priest of all of what's now modern day Wadi-Nasrun. So, sort of again a reaction to that, the service-oriented monasticism that's happening in Egypt now, creating sort of an avenue for those monks or those young men who want to live a celibate life, but also have inclinations towards monasticism. So giving them that opportunity, while always also creating an avenue for those who want a more contemplative life, a monastic life, by entering into the monastery. So in that respect, you see that sort of what's happening in diaspora is a reaction to what's happening in Egypt. In that respect, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. So you see that, or at least from your research, you have gathered that the diaspora is more conservative.
I don't like using words conservative or liberal. I don't think those are the right characteristics to use. What I prefer is sort of making sense. In diaspora, there's a sort of making sense of what monasticism looks like. Again, through the characteristic of the moral exemplar. The monk is the moral exemplar. So looking at monasticism as a way of life that is exemplary in a particular way, and sort of a reaction to that. So I wouldn't necessarily say liberal or conservative, but I would say more reactionary, if that makes sense. Like I said previously, I wouldn't say that. Rather than look at it in my interests are not looking at something as right or wrong, but rather how do my interlocutors think about these things, and why is it important to them in the way that they're thinking about it, and why are they saying that it's less authentic or more authentic, right? I think these are very questions that are very important. Again, like in Egypt, I had monks telling me that monasticism in diaspora is not really authentic because it doesn't reflect the Egyptian desert, or some monasteries aren't in the Egyptian desert, so that's not really monasticism. There's that historical tie to the Egyptian desert that makes it more authentic. Whereas again, reactionary in diaspora, you find that no, we are authentic, and we're trying to create an avenue that reclaims or revives the monastic tradition that is sort of changed in Egypt over time, with the increase again of access to monasteries from the laity and sort of becoming a little bit more isolated. Though that's still the case, I mean, in the United States, where monasteries are still very accessible, but sort of trying to create spaces where of inclusivity, just or exclusive spaces simply for monks.
And that issue of exclusivity, I mean, we've all grown up with monks. As you said, there is that image of the moral exemplar. And I've heard from many Copts that at one point or in time or another in their youth, they dreamt of becoming a monk. Yet we don't really know what life is like inside the monastery, and you've conducted extensive field work. So are there any interesting stories, fascinating tidbits that our audience would like to hear about?
Sure. There's one incident that happened with me with one of my monk interlocutor friends who I'll call for our purposes Father Akladios. I'd asked him, I was very interested in going into the desert and seeing anchoritic lifestyle, seeing a monk who lives as an anchorite and visiting one of these cells. So he arranged for a visit for me, for us to go to one of these cells, which is interesting, also described as going into the mountain. So again, the monastery is imagined as a higher platform than the rest of the world, and then when you enter into the desert, that's going even higher. So it's like as if one is climbing a mountain, although geographically or spatially speaking, the landscape is actually doesn't necessarily imply an ascent to a mountain. So that's something that also I found very fascinating, the way that monks talked about ascending to the monastery and then ascending further into the desert. So we ascended into the desert, into the mountain, and we came to a particular cell, the monk that we were going to visit, and I noticed that the monk wasn't there, and there's a worker, a lay worker who's not a monk, and there's actually maybe 2 or 3 of them, and they were working around the cell, planting and stuff. There's lots of greenery, and there's a gate around the cell, and I noticed a car there as well. So I turned to Abuna Akladios and I told him, this is the first note, and I pretended that I was jotting down notes. First observation of the anthropologist is that the monk in the desert has a car. So he looks at me sharply and he's like, "No, don't write that." So I was taken aback, and I thought I finished him like, here I'm exposing, the monastic life, the ways that, I'm sharing things that I shouldn't be sharing, and I thought he was offended. He was like, "No, you shouldn't share that." And he's like, "I want you to write down the proper thing." And I said, "What do you want me to do?" He said, "Abuna does not have one car, he in fact has 2, and the other one is in a car wash." So we laughed about that. It was sort of a joke that became very vivid in my mind after this whole event, and became sort of one of the main, if not the main, ethnographic experience, where I started to think again about the questions of moral exemplarity and monasticism as an imagined way of life, and monasticism in a practical sense as it is lived, with the effects of modernization and just simply monasticism being, in a sense, a part of society in a micro society and stuff, and it's not really divorced from society as much as we want to think, but there's a lot more connections in that respect, with the car as one very basic example of that case.
A clean, recently washed car.
A clean, recently washed car. That's right.
Any other stories that stick out in your mind?
Well, I only prepared for one.
Tell us about these mysterious monks.
Well, this thing, right? They're not really mysterious as we make them to be, right? They're regular human beings, as I think is right to characterize them, trying to live their life in their vocation the way that they see fit. It's not to discount that there are certain monks who are gifted with certain virtues, clairvoyance. Whether or not they are, it's not, again, not the point. But how they live their life. And they're monks that just try to live, they live within a micro society of sorts, where they deal with each other on a daily basis, similar to the way that we would in the world. Nothing very different from how we live, really, in terms of relationships and conversations and feuds at times, and making up after you get into a fight. I mean, it's thinking of sort of the regular relationships. I think to say that monks are angelic beings or human angels, as often characterizing, is, in a sense, they are, in that they engage in praising and a continuous life of worship. But on the other hand, they are human beings, and I think that's something I hope my research sheds light on a little bit more, and brings them to life as real human beings.
And that is commendable work, and I completely agree that sentiment needs to be shared widely. Now I want to ask you about your place in the world. How do you perceive the place of academics within the Coptic Church and Coptic communities more broadly?
This is a very important question. I'm glad you asked, because I think there are many taboos that need to be addressed when speaking about this specific question. I think there's an assumption within the church community that to be critical automatically assumes that you cannot be faithful. And if you're an academic studying the church, you're not really who you say you are, and you're sort of labeled as an outsider. I think this is a general feeling a lot of academics within the church feel or experience. Although I think there have been improvements in trying to bridge these gaps, particularly under Pope Akladios. For one example that I can think of is a theological conference that happened a few years ago, where academics and clergy came together, and there was sort of a theological conference where academics had played a very important part. But I think there's still a fear among many scholars who are part of the church that at any time they can be labeled as quote-unquote rebels and be ostracized by the community, particularly the hierarchy. So what I'm hoping is that my research really breaks these taboos and assumptions, in my emphasis that being critical doesn't mean that you are bashing or being negative about the church, but rather an invitation for having productive conversations on what it means to be a Copt, both as an academic and as one involved in the life of the church. They are not two things, but are in fact one and the same, and shouldn't be divorced. So really what I hope in future years, and I hope through my research, that the church hierarchy can give a visible role to academics, especially among the laity, and give them a voice to be able to have these productive conversations.
And do you foresee these conversations happening strictly in an academic setting or within the church?
I think there needs to be a healthy conversation happens in both spheres. As academics, we are required to present in an academic setting many times, right? I mean, part of our work is going to academic conferences and engaging with other scholars within our discipline, and that is good. But we can also offer that within the church, where we are able to have conversations about how our academic disciplines sort of give us the ability to be able to speak back to things within the church that are happening in situations that we can really have a good conversation.
And coming to this issue of conversations, we've talked about both within the church and in academic settings, but another factor is, given ongoing violence against Coptic populations in Egypt and escalating violence, do scholars have an obligation to become politically engaged?
It's a very good question, and I, at least for me, I think by virtue of me writing about Copts, I am politically engaged. As I mentioned earlier, that little work within anthropology has been done on Copts. So, by virtue of me writing about Copts, I am politically engaged, shedding light on the community that has been understudied, under-researched, and really what I try to do is give a voice to those who otherwise wouldn't be able to speak through my ethnographic research and my making sense of their worldviews.
Well, that's wonderful, and I'd like to thank you for joining us and conclude with a very important question to those young, bright-eyed scholars thinking about entering this field. What advice would you give to those interested in pursuing similar research?
Don't do it. No, seriously, don't do it.
Very emphatic.
Well, I'm at a stage in my of my PhD where I'm getting exhausted. So forgive me for being a bit cynical. But no, in all seriousness, I think it's important if especially young scholars or young youth within the church who are thinking about pursuing academia, remembering always that it's something important to do, and that you're able to give a voice again to the wider Coptic community, with all its different kinds of groups, right? And it's not going into it remembering that it's a commitment. It's financially precarious, and doing these are things. I mean, I have to be honest about thinking about. But other than that, I mean, really, if you see an opportunity or you feel that this is something that you can do, by all means do it, and do it well, and find your calling, so to speak. In doing so, just remember always the sort of things that come along with an academic career.
The challenges
of an academic career.
The precarity, I think, is the best word.
Yeah. But I definitely think that there needs to be more scholarship on Coptic Christians, and those within the church who are interested. It is doable, and you are in a position like me where you know a lot of the things already going, but you can shed light on other things that maybe you didn't think about growing up.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Joey, for joining us, and I'm sure I join the audience in thanking you for sharing your valuable and fascinating research. And this concludes our episode of Scholars Discuss Coptic Studies. I would like to thank our audience for tuning in, and our guest, Youssef, PhD candidate in Anthropology at the University of Toronto. I invite you to stay tuned for future posts to the Coptic Canadian History Project. To stay up to date, please follow the project on Facebook, Twitter, and by visiting us at www.thecchp.com. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.